going to have the session with Cyril and Prageeta, and there's just so much to talk about. So same thing where we're going to have a conversation for a while. I think the session ends at 4:45, so we're going to leave time for questions, obviously, from the audience. And then I'm going to say a few closing remarks, and then Collier's going to say a few things, and then we're done. So, okay. So I've got my notes here, and okay, wow. Well, both readings were fabulous, and they were so wonderful. And I saw intersections and, and things that were different. So I want to start by asking, it's a big question, but you guys can do whatever you want. So obviously there were these strands around the metaphysical, the mystical, the spiritual, and kind of different takes on that, but also some similarities perhaps. So I'm kind of interested in the positionality of being an Asian American writer from Framingham, for whom Hinduism or spirituality, sort of quote unquote Oriental spirituality, gets filtered through a lot of white writers or a lot of like hand-picked Asian writers that white people have picked, right? So it's sort of similar to when we grow up thinking about Chinese poetry and we go through Pound, right? It's not a problem, but there are some problems with it, right? There are problems, but so that positionality, as compared to Cyril growing up in Singapore, part of the sort of racial majority, I don't know about Buddhism and Hinduism and everything, how that, but it's not, it probably is filtered in some, I don't know, you can tell us. Because actually there was a remark that Cyril made years ago, and I probably botched it, but it stuck with me for a long time. And you can tell me if I was wrong. But a few years ago, it's quite a few years now, I met Cyril in Singapore through a mutual friend, and we were talking about Asian American poets and also Singaporean poets. And you said something to me, a sort of a casual thing, but you said you felt sort of bad for Asian American poets because in a way they were so bounded by the racialized minority position that's what they wrote about all the time, right? And you said, in a way, it was really nice to be from Singapore and to be able to write about Buddhism or metaphysical issues or whatever. And it always stuck with me. Not because I necessarily agreed 100%, but I thought it was so provocative, and it made me think about our positions, just like for us as Asian Americans or minority Americans, and how much people can ignore the issue of race, or they can ignore the issue of being minoritized, or they could be like Nikki Haley and say there is no racism. I mean, there's all ways to deal with it. It's not like there's one Asian American way of dealing with our relationship to the racial hierarchy, but in a way it's always present, whether you deal with it or not. So that always stuck with me. So I'm thinking about this freedom to think about the mystical or the metaphysical or the spiritual, and obviously there are a lot of other components. And Prageeta used a term, colonial Hinduism, but that may be about Hindu nationalism. It may be a different thing. I'm not sure. But settler universal selves. I guess I want to hear more about when you're in poetry and you're sort of exploring the spiritual, the religious, or whatever you want to call it, the mystical, the transcendental, the immanent. Do you feel? Well, I guess I could start with Cyril. Do you feel free of obviously there's the queer, the poet and the poetic voice, but is there a way in which you feel free of other things? And then I want to ask Prageeta, because I know Prageeta's been struggling with a lot, really interesting ways about Hinduism, her relationship to religion, or whatever you want to call it.
I mean, that remark sounds like me from that time. I wouldn't revise it very much because I was mentioning this on emails that we live in such a strange era of wokeness, which I hope expires soon, because it tends to be its own kind of fundamentalism about if you are a certain identity, you cannot talk about something else, which is very reductive, and sometimes there's also a lot of reverse racism and a lot of reverse. I mean, look, if I was a straight Chinese person and made that remark, I would be an asshole, right? But because I am also a queer person in Singapore, so I'm also speaking from the margin. So, hey, I got woke cred, it's so annoying, right? That I have to do things like that in order to justify that what I'm saying is, sometimes just facts, It's like sometimes people, even me included, I feel kind of like trapped by the fact that I have to address this pressure of writing about my minority, my queerness and stuff like that, and I think Mary Jean was talking about this as well, like being an incidental queer activist, even though I didn't really set out to be one. I don't want to be an activist of any kind. That's like the worst thing in the world I want to be. But because I was the only one doing it, I became that person. And I'm not the best representative of it. I'm not a shining example of anything. But then that also led to this challenge to like expanding the whole idea of queerness. Like, what do you mean by queer? So in Singapore, like, I hope I'm not offending anyone. I guess I don't care. Like, Christianity and Islam is like becoming a real issue. Like, you know, it's so, oh my God, it's becoming so fundamentalist. And so if you're not with us, you're just, God, you're just going to hell, right? I mean, because Christianity, I grew up Roman Catholic, and my father was like, you know, a catechism teacher. I almost became a priest because I was so pressured by my family to like become an altar boy. Oh, think of all the porn films. You know, anyway, they happened. So I've led a life. But yeah, so it kind of like, it forced me to reject like, you know, the institution of religion in a very traumatic way. I went through conversion therapy and all of those things in the church as well. But it also taught me so many things about like myself in relation to what it means to have spiritual truth that is wholly and individually mine. So when I became this incidental queer activist, writer, poet, or whatever you want to call it. I hate the categories. But when I became that, I decided that, okay, since you want me to be this person, I'm going to expand the idea of queerness in my writing. My queerness includes mysticism, includes Buddhism, includes aspects of Hinduism as well. And in Singapore, that's very controversial. So that's my take on it.
So, okay, right. So I did sort of remember what you said. Right. So well, of course, you know, I'm going to push back a little bit. So, and then I'm going to let Prageeta speak. So first of all, I hear you. I understand what you're saying. Because actually, one of my students brought up in class, which is a valid point. I was teaching, my undergraduate class is on Asian British and Asian American. And we read some of the poets here, but and one of my students said, and it's a good, valid point, that is everything reduced to racism? You know, don't all people have...
I don't mean to undermine the struggles.
No, I know, but I'm not saying you're saying it. But I understand this point because Leon Lee actually said something to me similar to me.
It's very Christian, right?
Well, it's also this, but maybe, yeah. But there's also this idea that people are obviously multidimensional and they have all these other dimensions to themselves, and it's not just... I get that. I understand, and I think it's a valid point. But I will push back on two things. One is that the language of wokeness and political correctness is the language of the right in the US. So I know it's filtered out to Japan and Asia because I've heard it in Japan. I've heard it. So I have a resistance to, and I understand what you're saying. So I'm not saying you're a right-wing, but I do have a problem when that kind of right-wing language, which shows how much the language of the United States, the political language, actually goes everywhere. So, you know, that I think is the language of woke and the language of political correctness is from the right, and it's very BIPOC, basically. But I get it. I know you don't mean it that way, so I'm just going to say that. My second point would be that I wonder if there is a zone where one is totally free to explore, you know, to do, you said, I want to do my own kind of religious thing, or I want, but you know, and then, you know, this goes back to the beginning comments that I made about colonialism. I don't know if Buddhism is ever, or any of this stuff is free of everything that's happened for centuries. I mean, we live in the midst of, and we're not post-modernity, which is since 1492 dominated by certain Western theory, I mean, enlightenment, everything. It's just, you know, and so we might be like, yeah, we're resisting and stuff is really hard, you know. But I also hear that you don't want to be reduced. And I think most Asian American and all writers of color don't want to be reduced to that representative, that ethnographic, like, tour guide, that anthropological, you know, whatever, native informant. It's very reductive, you know. But I think what we've seen in the last couple of days, and also I know just from Asian American writing and Asian British writing, and is that the variety of actually minority writing has been very wide. I mean, it hasn't been that reductive. It's been going on for a really long time. It's just that, like, white critics, like Mary Jean had been saying, that they tended to read it that way, or to want to read the Oriental, or to say that all people of color have always been representational. They don't have the capacity for abstraction. But you look at Native American pottery from like thousands of years ago, and it was not a lot of it was abstract and beautiful. I mean, just amazing. So I would just say that, but I wanted to let Prageeta speak too, because you've been thinking a lot about this, Prageeta.
I was just thinking about the native informant phrase. And I think I've been trying to really think about who my poetry is for now. I think the first couple of books I was really immersed in a post-New York school, post-romantic idea of a feminist self, kind of thinking about ideas of lineage to poetry. And then I moved to Montana. I wrote Under Gloom, and I realized I wanted to speak back to the institution, a self that had authority. So that was the politics of that. Is what's our writing like when we're thinking about our own sense of authority? And then with this new one, my dad is a Hindu priest and he's a mathematician. And when we are approaching the death of my second husband, he had nothing he could offer me. He couldn't offer me any condolence the first time either. He did the cremation ceremony. He even married me the first time. But what I found was the ceremonies were good for him. Were they doing anything for me beyond an idea of closure? Maybe ideas of closure, but not, they didn't help me think about suffering. And then when I thought about Hinduism's structure, I was going to show this 5-minute film called We Are Not Your Monkeys, which is by the filmmaker Anand Patwardhan, who it's a 2-part poem by I'm totally blanking on the community of Dalit poets, but it is speaking. But Anand Patwardhan wrote this with Daya Payer, and it's recited by. I will let you know. But the recitation addresses a retelling of the Ramayana, and essentially, like, there's 2 ways of thinking about how Hinduism came to be. Either it is originating in India, or it is the Aryan invasion. And then when we think about Dalits being tribal and indigenous, that is a fundamental and important way of reading identity. But often with Hindutva ideology, there's an argument that's being made that Hindus are indigenous, which is very problematic. But the poem itself does a rendering of the Ramayana and then a post-independence discussion of Dr. Ambedkar's constitution to talk about the way in which caste is staged in mythology. And when we look at both animals or demons, we're looking at casting tribal identities as these pejorative figures in mythology. So I just started to question whether it was legitimate enough for me to utilize mythology in an honest way when we have a whole group of people who are not afforded an afterlife in Hinduism, and obviously labor structures. And if I was going to be honest about my politics in the U.S. where I was born, and I wouldn't have certain ideologies, why am I so sentimental about Hinduism when I'm not learning very much from it? So that was my crisis. It wasn't teaching me about death. It wasn't teaching me about suffering. The parable was so neutral and generalized, and then usurped by New Age culture and whiteness, and so vague. When I even I taught the Katha Upanishad in my prosody class to try to get my students to turn it into a sonnet, to figure out what would happen if we had more description when we retold an Upanishad. What would it look like? But I also just started to question a deep sentimentality of projection that people did with mythology. And then I wondered, as an Asian American, if the relationship was too sentimental and too neutral, and that we weren't doing a service to unpacking our identities with each other, or our ideas of ourselves, or our ideas of what mysticism actually means when we're not just organized around it. So I just was trying to I don't know if that,
No,
that was
that's
just-
helpful, actually. And I actually have a follow-up question about the role of poetry then, because we know that, well, like in the 19th century in England, there was that whole debate, there was that resurgence in religiosity with the Oxford School. But a lot of people felt that art became the place where people who lost faith in religion, they turned to art. Right? This is not new. Like Terry Eagle, a lot of people have written about this, right? But this move to like poetry being almost like the place where you put religious feeling, or you find like almost like religious enlightenment, not really, but you know what I mean, spiritual, mystical kind of. And I wonder about that because I remember once taking a course with Alan Grossman, this poet. I don't know if people have heard of him, but we were discussing Gerard Manley Hopkins, who was a priest, a Catholic priest, and a very good poet, But I remember Grossman saying in class, Professor Grossman saying, well, he must not have been very sure of his faith, because if you were really sure of your faith, you wouldn't be writing poetry too, because your belief would be in that, So, and I always thought about that. I was like, okay. So I wonder in the ways for you two specifically, I'm not talking generically about poetry and religion, but do you feel that in a way that because you're a lapsed Catholic, or you were a Catholic, you're coming out of Hinduism, does poetry offer something different or better or alternative, or what does it do? Does it address suffering, like Prageeta was saying? Is there something that poetry does?
I think I want to address the suffering part, because I think we were talking about this, right? Like because all these structures of like religious, like Hinduism, Christianity, I think the problem we keep coming up against as like, people from the margins, or people with like, with issues in society. These institutions never address suffering in any kind of productive way, and the suffering only can be addressed in a productive way if there is specificity in the way it deals with, like, what is your suffering, not in the sense of, suffering is just bad karma, and that it's not something generic or something like that, or like original sin, or things like that. So because of that, I guess poetry also becomes its own institutionalized form of like oppression as well sometimes. In Singapore, it's just a very small country, but it can be very problematic when poetry was used by the Singapore Tourism Board, was used by older poets to kind of fight back against colonialists and to forge a national identity. So there was no talking about any other kind of narrative that deals with the self, that deals with the diversity of being human in Singapore, that doesn't deal with mystical truths or any kind, that doesn't deal with inequality. It's all about celebration, 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 right? So for me, poetry became that way of like, I see some freedom here where I can do whatever the fuck I want, right? That's fun. That's fun to do, and I can do it in public, right? So I love stirring up shit in Singapore, right? I love like showing up every day and going like, I'm going to talk about my body, things like that. I'm going to talk about how I hate Christianity. I'm going to talk about like, and people will be like, that gives me the freedom to like, poetry, not just the words on the page, but the talking about poetry in public. All of this gives me freedom to talk about like new ways of looking at what it means to be human, about mysticism, new ways of thinking about spiritual truth. Even if your spiritual truth is one of like atheism, that also is, to me, a kind of spiritual truth. Yeah, even if you're agnostic, it's just to make that space for that kind of like ambiguity, that space of freedom that otherwise would be quickly eclipsed. Sometimes if I wasn't there, like in the early 90s, things like that. Yeah.
Do you want to respond or not? Okay, because we can keep going. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I'm hearing what you're saying. Because of course in Singapore, if you're saying they're using poetry for like nationalistic purposes, as like the tourist board or whatever,
It's not the case anymore. Talking about a very specific time. Yeah.
But I think it's really important because actually my teaching here at CUHK and having all of you all here, it does remind us that our subject, like where we're located, our subject position, our racial identity or whatever, our sexual, all these things, it's not the same. I think like we're all like of Asian descent, right? But depending on where we're located, it's very different. Like there's some similarities, but there's also difference. Because I would say that when you talked about like wanting to have poetry be the place where you could be human and everything, I think in the United States, I'm just going to speak to the United States, like poetry workshops, but I'm thinking about colonial enterprises like using Shakespeare as a kind of litmus test of the human or the superior, right? So in that sense, the non-white, the non-British was inferior. Because, I mean, come on, people...
Thank you, Harold Bloom, right?
right, but everyone, not just like everyone, not just Harold, but yeah, I mean, this idea that, and I've heard people say this, I mean, like, Shakespeare is the greatest poet that ever lived, right? A lot of people believe that. I mean, and, yeah, go ahead.
No.
Yeah.
There was one part of your question that I think can speak to what you're also talking about, which is assimilation.
Yes, I mean, well, I guess the question about whether poetry affords you the space to be like explore humanity and being human, as a kind of or reprieve from the nationalistic coercion or whatever you want to call it, or power structures. But the fact is that poetry, in terms of Britain, was used as a very active weapon of colonialism. It isn't just the militarism in the ships, right? It was really like, we have Shakespeare and you're nothing. And so I'm always thinking about that too, because but there's not one thing or the other. It's all there's a lot of things, because you can still love Shakespeare. It's not saying like, let's do away with Shakespeare. Because poetry has that side, which it's been used very much as, I think, an elitist tool often of superiority. And many of us have talked over the last couple days about how English is just in this hierarchy, right? Because I know my mother went to junior high school in Hong Kong. She went to Maryknoll, a Catholic school, an American Catholic school. And she said, is like, of course the British were on top. And then if you knew English as a Chinese person, you were like better than the people who didn't speak English. And Mary Jean talked about that. And Mary Jean's much younger than my mother. So, it's still going on. I mean, I think, and Don Nee talked about it. But also been in Hong Kong. So I think there's that. But I also know that poetry is a place that for some people is like I was reading this memoir of this lawyer named Hans Litten who had challenged Hitler before Hitler became the head of Germany. And he was trying to prosecute Hitler. And then so when Hitler became in power, he tortured him. I mean, he arrested him and he tortured him. And he committed suicide eventually. But he turned to Rilke in prison. I mean, it was like the only thing he could do when he was in so much pain and suffering was to turn and recite poetry. So I think about that too, right? So it's not one or the other. But Prageeta, you want to say something? I don't know if you want to. What was my question?
There were several that I wanted to think about.
Right. Is poetry like an alternative to religion? Does it address suffering? Is there?
I think
if you don't have religion, like what does poetry do?
Well, I guess I've been thinking about what poetry does in different circles and why we write in kinship with different communities. I think in the U.S. for me, going through an MFA program in the 90s. I went to a really experimental one, so it was sort of. I went to Brown, which was it was really different from a lot of the others. It was very different from Iowa at that time. Now programs, everybody's sort of reading the same thing, but at that time it was so different, and I felt the possibilities of finding. Strangeness really exciting, and I couldn't find that many South Asians in the U.S. who were committing to an avant-garde practice. It just seemed really impossumi. I think it maybe was around the late '90s when I lived in New York City that I found Sumi Kaipa, I found Banu. Maybe it was just two people at that time in the late 90s. Vijay Seshadri lived next door, and I felt like we were some kind of, like, I wish we had he was my neighbor. I felt like he would come out and we'd talk about poetry outside, and he would mentor me, but it was about canonical work and how it afforded him an assimilation. But I guess so the option of really writing, I felt like a quirky freak, and I was trying to figure out a language for that. And so I think what I started to do is to think about poetry as a Bohemian space. And then if we think about the South Asian Bohemian identity, that's why I sort of brought the Beatles in, because the Double Fantasy album in 1980 was so essential to my aesthetic upbringing. That album changed my life, and Yoko Ono changed my life as this avant-garde practitioner who could seduce, John Lennon. All of that was so fantastic. That was mystical to me. That was, Oh, sorry. um, I, so
Right.
I,
And
I,
she's so demonized in the
I
larger
know, but
culture
she's
as
such
like
a genius.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, actually,
I'm
this
sorry.
but actually, this is a good way for me to bridge to the question of the lyric, because I do want to talk about that with both of you, which is that. So you read love poems, Cyril, and then you've written and read some grief poems. And I'm wondering about the lyric, which traditionally the lyric does deal with very emotional things. You know, we could define the lyric whatever way, but you know, so I'm curious about the lyric, and both of you, I guess, about whether you push against the lyric, you do in other ways too. They're not the same ways. But are there ways in which the lyric, as sort of the repository or the kind of conduit of love or of grief, has already been, it's already prescribed in a certain way? Like, you know, there's a kind of traditional love poem. I mean, we know, like Shakespeare sonnets or whatever. We've all, in the English language, we know this, right? We've talked about breakup poems, right, Prageeta? But there's a kind of way, and Prageeta and I have had these conversations about how, at least in the United States, a lot of the lyric poems around emotion tend to be centered on white emotions, so that the most quotidian aspects of like a breakup or like love, or it becomes like oracular or the voice of God, or, you know, like universal and all this stuff, which we find tiring after a while. So I don't know the context in Singapore, but I'm wondering about the lyric, and is it, you both use lyric language, but you do different things, and I think I'd like to hear about the lyric form and what is it already overused in a certain, because when you write in English in Singapore, so it's not the same as writing in English in like New York or Boston.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
I've always said,
Yeah.
I mean, whenever, because I go to Australia a lot for festivals and things like that, and I always realize every time I go there that if I were born Australian, or even if I was born Australian Chinese, I'll probably just be the author of one or two books and probably be meditating on the beach somewhere. I wouldn't really be fighting any fight. I'll just be happy just writing the two books and reading from them for the rest of my life. But in Singapore, it's like I found it was so oppressive in the way. I mean, just to talk about it in a different way, like, you know, you're talking about lyric, right? Lyric poetry, I mean, we are post-colonial. We inherited all the English, British English forms, and all the older poets, they were all inspired by Yeats, by Keats. So they were weaponizing that kind of lyric voice to talk about, like, you know, Singaporean things. So it's like a poem by Edwin Thumboo can read like, this sounds like a poem by Yeats, but it's not. And it's like, it's talking about the Malayan, it's talking about like the Marina Bay, it's talking about, it's just very bizarre that I'm like, why are you writing a love poem to a statue? It's it's so strange to me. And so I kind of like, I wanted to subvert that kind of like, so I think what I'm saying is that whatever forms that we inherit, I think Larry has said this about how the language that comes to us is given to us by history, right? So the things that fall on our laps, and then we can either inhale it completely like a new drug, like Christianity, and just not question it at all, or you can question it, but it's a starting point. So it's like, I decided to re-weaponize it for myself, to talk about non-nationalistic things, to talk about mysticism, to talk about queerness, to talk about gay sex in a very explicit way. I just like turned it, but in my heart of hearts, it's like, yeah, I mean, it's still very Wordsworth. It's still very, you know, all of that is still within me. I still see myself as very much a very romantic poet. And to me, I've done like essays on like romantic poetry, and I find mysticism in all of it, in Wordsworth, in all of them. I mean, to me, they're mystical poets. They talk about the sublime. They talk about, like, you know, nature in a way that's not just decorative and things like that. I wanted to merge that with my own queerness and, yeah, bring that to the forefront, at least in my country. Yeah.
I guess I think that I'm a little cynical about mysticism in American poetry, because it does feel like either it's public facing. If I talk about South Asian poetry, I'm often trying to have a real conversation with other South Asian poets to say, what are we writing for each other, or are we writing for a white reader? And can we be deeply honest about what that means? And And if we're writing for each other, does the poem actually, is this the poem? What would that look like if I was, just writing to my community about the things that are vexing? Would that be a legible poem? I started to try to do that in some of my poems to try to figure out what's the real intimacy that I could create. What's the kind of kinship that would offer me some space of care that would be real. I feel like my relatives in India all think I'm super cursed, so they don't even talk to me now. They're like, "Whoa, and so like two like double widow, no way." And so I'm really on my own. I'm really thinking about what it means to look at this next several decades alone with my spirituality. And to think about what the poem does and what kind of intimacy am I initiating with other poets. I'm thinking about what you say about the me in your poem is forthright. It's a direct address to the audience or the reader. It's a lyric address that allows no one to turn away.
Yeah, but I think it also allows, I think what you said really I connected with is that it's something that I guess I never really articulate enough, which is when you articulate such things, it's about how one poet connects to another as well. When you're writing, it's not just to an audience, but you're writing to some imagined like community of like poetic discourse or other poets that you're in conversation with. But it's just that in some cases, perhaps with you as well, I think you might find this, sometimes the conversation is really ultimately with yourself, whether you like it or not, and you just have hope and faith that somehow there'll be someone like you that you will be connecting with on this level, right?
Yeah.
And to me, that's mystical. For me, mysticism is not something, I know we keep using these words, but it's not woo-woo stuff, I'm not talking about crystals and, and feng shui directions, I'm talking about something very simple, which is like interconnectedness, right?
Yeah.
What is it? Do you know what it is? The moment you actually unpacked it, the more you don't know about it. That's all I'm saying. And poetry is just the beginning of understanding that mystery or what it means to be sublime, to be interconnected, to be one with everything, and not in the cheesy, like you said, the Western diluted version, the Beatles, like imagine we're all one, kind of like chorus from that. John Lennon, I love it. I love it too. But for me, it's a begin. Everything becomes a cliche over time, and I think it's up to the poets and to the academics to rewrite that cliche in a way that's going like, no, there's still truth here. We're just blinded by the hackneyed versions of it, and it's just our role to like find new truth and meaning in it, and to connect with each other as writers and audiences and stuff like that. Yeah.
Did you want to say something?
That's why I found the Barnett Newman painting so important, because it was this abstract expressionist piece that I kept returning to, but it was also a kind of bohemia that I found in my own world of the visual art world, and that it was, but it was trying. Newman is trying to imagine a sublime that does handle a political self too. Like he's trying to do all this work to engage. So I was just trying to figure out what mine would be if I thought about this space of encounter. But I
think you're more consciously political about it, I think, than I am perhaps. Like you are very like you said, how is the spirituality tied to a political self? Whereas I kind of have maybe blind faith in the fact that I'm already political by dealing with this.
Yeah.
Like maybe it's a very misleading kind of faith, but I just hope that I am making that kind of political difference.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. But I think you're a lot more mindful about it. Like how does it tie to political, like individuality, subjectivity, suffering? you know?
I think it's only because I'm critical of a cultural Hindu identity that I'm resisting in my social space, where there feels like a weird hierarchical supremacy around purity, that, you know, like I see it in Nikki Haley. I'm gonna get in trouble, but I see it,
Yeah.
you know, and so there's a performative shamanism that I'm critical of culturally, for me in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that coincides with the fact that I feel like now things are getting worse in terms of this, like in India now, there's this Hindutva movement which is really oppressive. It's like Christianity in a way. It's like you all have to, like, you know, if you're Hindu, then it means you're proud to be Indian. You're proud to. It's like, hang on, spirituality is not tied to your passport. I mean, it's like, can you stop? Like, what's the disconnect? It's very like, you know, Sadhguru or all these weird gurus now. It's just, are we in this age of dictatorships in terms of religious dictatorships, political dictatorships, and like, does it all tie together to what you're saying? Like, you know, it creates distrust for any kind of like, how do you say it? Like fashionable ways of discussing mythicism now. It just undermines everything that we try to do, which is why we always have to rewrite it and tie it to something more real, a political subjectivity, tied to suffering, tied to real truths that we are all living as individuals, you know? Yeah.
Actually, I want to open it to the audience. I had another question, but I think it's time to let the audience speak, and if, you know, see what they have to ask you guys, and then I can always comment later. But yeah, questions. Who has the? There's a person with the mic who's going to go around. Oh, the mic. Okay, and you can take mine. Yeah. Okay. So, any questions for Gita or Cyril, or both? Yeah, there's a lot to think about.
You don't have, I mean, it doesn't have to be about the religious thing.
Yeah.
There's the lyric, there's American poetry.
Anything they talked about. Yes. Okay.
I know that a lot of the conversation has been decentering the canon and also decentering whiteness, but I also think that two of the things that you guys touched upon have to do with sometimes negotiating with different kinds of whiteness, whether it's in feminist avant-garde circles, whether it's in the queer community. And I just want to ask you a little bit about how you sort of configured, you know, artistic and political valences that felt authentic to you, while also negotiating sometimes the things that you were attracted to or circles you were running in were also replicating other kinds of power structures.
I've in this new manuscript, I'm writing a lot about lateral violence, and just the problem of both BIPOC communities reproducing violence that, you know, has been rewarded in white communities, or just reproducing a kind of violence that we've already been subjected to. But I think the 90s were really a place where I didn't understand how white the avant-garde poetry scene was. And then the aughts sort of changed, you know, after I think 2014. Like we talk a lot about, like Undergloom felt really dangerous, and publishing it in 2013 and writing it from 2009 onward, in a way that it has a different, it reads differently now than it did. I think my community was a little worried for me, like it wasn't a safe thing to try to publish. So I think it's really interesting to figure out what you develop as your vigilance around whiteness, what's brave, and related to a moment. I don't know if I'm answering your question. I'm just thinking about, like, I don't know who I was 10 years ago, and what I thought was scary around white poetry is so different than it is now. Now I'm a little bit, I am a little critical of how mainstream poetry is, in the sense that everybody does love everything. And I just want to think about that a little bit because historically in the 80s, a lot of these, white poets who might have loved one or two BIPOC poets who assimilated nicely and wrote canonically were really prickly if they couldn't make you assimilate to them. But now everybody loves their work, and I'm trying to figure out if I'm just being cranky about the past, but I really want to think about why some of why the promise of, say, avant-garde poetry is maybe important in some circles, that BIPOC avant-garde work is about not assimilating. And what does it mean to assimilate in terms of thinking about prosody? But it's different for different communities.
I don't know. I feel like there are names on the tip of your tongue. Like I just wish you just say. I just want to be like. Sorry, I'm just a gossip queen. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Actually, can I say?
Yeah.
I may name
Go,
names.
go,
Yeah,
please. Dorothy will say it.
No, but because of course I remember that moment, and you remember how scary it was when you were writing. Well, Undergloom did seem like, oh my God, it's all out there, because Prageeta's books up until then had been very more oblique about racial identity, but especially racism. But in Undergloom, it's just all out there, And that was around the same time I published my book, and it was frightening. It was like absolutely terrifying. I was untenured woman of color, criticizing the most powerful literary critic in the country. She was head of the MLA and the doyen of avant-garde criticism. It was absolutely terrifying. People were like, I was like, I don't care, I'm doing it. But it was scary, and we talked about it. I mean, that was the moment. But now people are like, why weren't you fiercer? Or why didn't you do more about her? And they're like the really radical, young people are just like, you were too nice to her. And I was like, are you kidding me? Do you know what that was like? I was going to lose my livelihood and my job. And my advisor even said to me at one point, and he's like a radical Irishman who, he had said to me, well, there's a fine line between being right and being tactless. So he even criticized me. So I was like, totally, it was hard, I would just say. But it's true that what you're saying, Prageeta, that with time, the things that we all do, or everyone does, that we open up, and then it becomes like, oh, why didn't you do more? It just people forget. People forget how hard it was and how terrifying. And that actually, there is a whole question about people's livelihoods. And the whole thing, because that was actually the question I was going to ask about the reality of needing white reviewers, white readers, awards, and things for some people who don't have academic jobs. People live in very precarious positions economically. So a lot of people do have to figure out how to please critics, and the readership, and get published, and it's hard. So there is that pressure, right, to you were talking about, well, who was talking about their reader, thinking about the reader? Somebody, I can't remember now, but having to think about that. And I remember once I was asked to write the preface to a Black British anthology of poetry by these are African British women. So I wrote this thing about colonialism and everything, of course, And there was one line I put in about, and of course we know these awards are just fraudulent. They're just a way of picking the mascot, the favorite mascot. And she said, please take that out, because we want those awards. And I understood. I mean, she said, we haven't even gotten those awards. We haven't even gotten to that point. Because at that point, a lot of the older Black British who were writing more mainstream poetry were actually going to the U.S. to attend some of the Black conferences that discussed African American writing. So I said, of course I'll take it out, because I'm not in Britain. It's not, I can write that, but she was like, we actually don't want to. She didn't want to offend the people that might get the awards. I get it, right? But that's a reality, and we know that because awards are big business in the U.S. And Prageeta's been a judge. And we've all seen the behind-the-scenes thing. And of course, sometimes there's a correlation, a matchup between a really good poet and a really good award, but often there isn't. So you just see, because we know poetry, so we know who's really good and who's just been very ambitious and kiss ass, and been acceptable and had and then they got a big award. I'm not saying everyone who gets an award is like that, but there are also very, very talented people who are just completely.
I mean, there was one time I remember one year there was this controversy about how Jory Graham's students kept getting the awards, everyone from her class.
Poetry.
And then every time when she was called out about it, she just came out and said, "I'm so horrified. It's the Oprah Winfrey response, right? I'm horrified. It's the worst thing I've ever heard." I'm like, okay. I mean, same with Mark Strand or stuff like that. I mean, is this still happening now?
I think in different ways. I mean, we actually had a friend, well, no friend, this is an ex-friend, who was like one of that Jory Graham marks. And I have to say the anecdote. I won't say the name of the person. But so Jory Graham did have, and later Louise Glick, they have a lot of power. So they recommend all the people for the American Academy of Poets, all the fellowships. I mean, they pick the poets, the book prizes and stuff. And this friend had been in that circle. So had gone to Iowa, had been Jory's student, had been a favorite, and had applied for the American Academy of Rome and not gotten the fellowship. And then she said to me, so I told Mark Strand I didn't get it, and he whipped out his checkbook and wrote me a check for $15,000 because he said he had this extra money and he was going to give it to me. And I was like, oh my God. So but we know all this. I mean, because we see it with other things that have happened with, like I was on a poetry search at Williams. I can say this because I'm leaving Williams now, but I'm going to Tufts. But but at Williams, and we had a poetry search. It was a junior poetry search, and Louise Glick used to teach at Williams. I mean, she's big, right? She's a very big person. So she had left, and then the senior guy there, who had always been overshadowed by her, but then when we had the search, he called her up and said, "Who are the poets on this list? All these people applied. Who would you pick?" And I said, this is illegal. You can't do that. Like, people don't want their names out there. And so she put the list together. Of course, it was people she had picked before for things. And I just knew it was going to be one of those people on the list. And it was. So the person who got hired was that. So there's a lot of corruption, But that's true anywhere. I mean, that would be true in, like, used car business or... I mean, anything, right? So that, but I think people are shocked. But I want to go back to the fact that poets also, if you don't have an academic job, it's scary because you can't afford to offend, and that means usually white critics, white readers. There's a very prominent Asian American fiction writer whom I will not name, who is very big, and then had come to my school, and the students asked him about whether he liked Teresa Cha, who's an avant-garde, a Korean American poet. And he said, yeah, I really like Cha. But I wasn't going to write a thing like Dictée because I like the honesty, I have to say. The honesty was good. He said, because I knew I wanted to write a novel that would please the white literary critics at the New Yorker and I could get a Pulitzer Prize. So I'm like, okay, wow, that's really honest, right? And it's exactly what happened. He got the Pulitzer Prize. So it really is this kind of...
It's very depressing.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Maybe it's the United States. I don't know.
I mean, I'm just stating as a fact. I mean, we have writers Singapore is nothing like that in terms of the scale, but we do have like authors that have like, even in public settings like conferences, there'll be like people who have won the literature prizes all the time, and they'll say this, I only wrote this book because I won the prize. I wrote it to cater to a certain kind of like, they'll just say it's very pragmatic, again, the very Singaporean word, very pragmatic, but also very cynical and self-aware way, and everyone just nod. And I just feel like I'm in the twilight zone because I'm like, really? This is, okay, so he wrote this book not to be an authentic artist. He wrote this book because he wanted to win the prize again and again and again. Right. So.
But my point is also not to necessarily demonize individuals. I mean, of course I can be like, oh, I don't respect that, but whatever, But I think it is about that whole system. Like, that's the way. Yeah. It's a colonial system because really, the legacy of colonialism also is that you could always have one mascot. So people like about slavery, oh, Frederick Douglass, he did great, right? Okay, yeah, Frederick Douglass did great, but how about the other people? We didn't do that great. I mean, he did well, but you know what I mean? But that whole mascot system, you pick the one person that survived and you point it and say, oh, the system's not that bad because Frederick Douglass did well. Or you pit people against one another. So to me, this is where you have the material, capitalistic, the constraints against people, against any poet, but especially poets of color, I would say. I mean, they're just real material constraints that make it really, and it affects your poetry. Cause it affects criticism because you're terrified. You're thinking, I'm not going to get tenure. I will be on the street. What do I do? So do I make the calculation to tell the truth, or do I not? And it's hard. So I don't know.
I mean, I'm just going to embarrass on me and say, your work has been honored, and and I admire the recognition you've received because of how risky the work is and how important it is. So I do want to say that many of us get prizes and get acknowledged for risk and important stuff. It's when we're imagining we have to construct something false or assimilate in a way that I think we're trying to critique that.
Yes.
I just wanted to.
And I want to be clear, because I did say this earlier. It's not that every person who's won a prize doesn't deserve prizes, because there's plenty of people who won prizes who deserve prizes. It's just, and I have no problem with prizes. I mean, it's fine. I think it's good, you know. But I think that there's. I guess what I'm saying is not even about the prizes. It's about a kind of reality that affects people in their work. Then, so when people sort of say, I don't ever think about the reader. I'm just like writing for myself. Maybe that's fine, you know. But it's a hard fact that there's certain things that are going to sell. So I was there in New York. I was working as an intern at Newsweek decades ago, and I was working when Amy Tan became a phenomenon. And that was created by the publishing industry. I can say for a fact. Because Louise Erdrich had just had a big hit with Love Medicine. She was the first sort of BIPOC, indigenous writer who became. And I remember there was buzz at Newsweek. They were like, can you interview this person on the phone? Because her book The Joy Luck Club had not come out yet. But it was just like, this is going to be a big thing. It's going to be. I was like, okay, you know. So talked to her on the phone and stuff. But so a lot of it is. It's not like everything's like that, but there is a reality out there, and I think it does affect people. It's hard not to be affected by that when you're writing. You know, I think. But maybe I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Are there more questions? Yeah. There are questions.
Hello, hi. Call from English department. I'm doing a creative and critical PhD program here. I want to ask you, both of you, because you wrote very differently about your own families, and especially I remember Cyril said, "My father is just a piece of furniture," a prompt in my poetry. So I'm really curious how you two felt about each other's work, and also especially about the use of family in your poetry. And also, based on this question, we all like to read about our own families. So how do you work with these family materials? Like, how do you decide which part of the very complicated emotions about your family, which part of the emotions will went into your poetry, but the others will go into other works? Like, how do you decide on the layers of emotion that you felt about your family? I think this is a two question.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure about the first question. It's like, I mean, I don't care what my parents feel about. I mean, I'm very aware that my parents read my work, but they don't understand it. Like, yay, poetry, right? Metaphors, what that, yeah.
For each other's work, you felt about.
Oh, right, all right. That's a much longer discussion. Yeah, I mean, I'm extremely moved, actually. I mean, there's so much to unpack in terms of like the whole topic of grief, and like I think we have a very, it's a conversation that cannot end. I mean, how do we deal with grief and loss and stuff like that? And poetry is really not an ending; it's a beginning to like, not even recovery, to understanding it and making space for the shock of loss. And without it, I mean, even though we do not fully recover, without poetry, without writing about it, without even having conversations, it's even worse, right? We're just, yeah. What was the second question again? Like, I mean, for me, which parts to pick when writing about family, stuff like that? I mean, the worst parts, of course. So for me, because I'm a bitter, contemptuous queen, but I do pick the worst parts. But it's like one thing I love about poetry, and I'm sorry I sound facetious. I think it's the coffee, like, or the tiramisu, but I don't mean to be facetious. But for me, when I write about things like anger, and I write about like being whatever, harassed, abused, or like forgotten by my parents, I use the poem as a way of discovery as well. How may I talk about this that teaches me something new about it? And I have written poems that kind of like starts with the hatred, starts with like, my father is like a piece of furniture, stuff like that, but it ends with like, I'm actually okay with it. I see the bigger picture, and I'm also, I'm part of the picture, and I don't forgive him, but I'm a more generous towards him, and that surprises me about the poetic journey. So it's not just like, it's not just a face. Does anyone still use Facebook? Like, it's not just a Facebook post, right? It's like, I hate you. You're an asshole. You know what I mean? It's not like that. It's just like through metaphors and through discovery, and the surprise. I think Mary Jean's talking about sustenance and how like the way you arrange, the way you constrain yourself, the way the poem kind of like forces you to rewrite certain things at the end. You just surprise yourself like, oh, this is a new thought. I never saw this in this way before. And that wouldn't have been possible without the poetic journey. Yeah. So that's my answer to that.
I will say about your poetry, I love what it bluntly confronts, and there is this direct address, like I said before, to speaking about family. I mean, or even the description is efficient. You have an efficient description.
It's a very Singaporean description. Yeah, but yeah.
But I was just that one poem. I think I can't speak for. I can only. I think one thing I learned in the last 10 years is my parents stopped infantilizing me when my first husband got sick, and then when he died, I realized he wasn't the greatest guy, and I really accommodated him, his ex-wife, and my stepdaughter too much. And they were not Indian, but I felt used. But I also felt like I had one relationship with my parents, and then I had this other weird compromised relationship, and I wanted to unpack it in some way that afforded me an evaluation that I could have in a poem that was my own perspective. But I do think in the last 10 years, I mean, my mom has since passed, but they stopped infantilizing me, and they started to need me to anchor this space differently. And so I brought my rage there and my own power. So I just started thinking differently. I miss my mom and I love my dad, but they can no longer help me make decisions. And so the poems are trying to negotiate. I don't know if that answers anything, but that's how I approached that poem.
I think there was
So I wanted to ask two questions. So yesterday I also sat in Larry's keynote. Larry's talking about his poem, and then he said that when he's away from home, he starts writing right afterwards. And I want to ask whether, looking back in your works, do you find that there are particular moments when you're most compelled to write through poetry, and like something similar, like a switch that compels you to write through poetry? And then my second question is, do you guys still keep old drafts of your poetry? Maybe in the process of creating poetry, what do you edit in and out of it, especially when you're considering to maybe publish your work?
I had this opportunity, just thinking of the latter part of your question, I'll start there. I had this opportunity to publish a very old poem that I wrote in grad school, the original and then what it turned out to be. And to write an essay, it was like a Bloomsbury thing on the art of revision, and it was comforting to look at old drafts and see what I was thinking about originally. That was cathartic to kind of just identify it. So I always think it's important to keep those drafts, so they just remind you of how you're thinking about something.
With regard to her first question about place, is there a place where you feel comfortable to write and to create? Is there any like away from home or at home? Is there a difference, or is there like I think what Larry talked about this pendulum?
You know, I think home has changed a lot for me with this loss. So I'm actually rebuilding an office space, but I think it's having my books where I can retrieve things, you just learn a lot. You know, when my husband was dying, I was in hospice for 23 days, and he was falling unconscious, and I had my laptop, and I was sleeping by him in this bed, and I just would be there for so long that I started writing at 3 a.m. a lot on the laptop, and I realized if I can write here in hospice, I can write anywhere when I'm compelled. So I just was trying to challenge myself to document. I don't know. So everything's changed.
I mean, I don't know how to follow up with after that, but I mean, my short answer to the first one is I was rendered homeless against my will, so I don't have a sense of home to begin with. So I've always wanted to. The poetry was about me longing for home, because my family kind of kicked me out for being the way I am, you know. So the longing for home, and then finding a home with my partner, and then like celebrating it with my poetry, that became. I don't know whether that answers your question about home, but that's my complicated answer about it. With regard to the second question about drafts, I just this part of me is very Buddhist. Like it's gone. I just don't care about it. I know that my life will always have new material, because my life is just, like I said, I'm a messy queen. Things will happen to me somehow, and I'll have something to write about. It's just I'll never have writer's block. It's just my life is very chaotic. At least in here, yeah.
Any more questions? Maybe one more question? Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, wait. There's one here and one there. So why don't we do these two? Yeah.
Actually, I have a follow-up question with Valerie. So I want to ask about your creative mode, because you mentioned before you write when you feel you push yourself to writing, because I feel like for some people writing is like my metaphor is like to puke. Like you have to write the poem out, or else like you're feeling dying. Or like, would you? you are like at the time. So I was wondering, when you guys write, are you conscious of your work? Like, are you conscious that I am a poet writing this poem, or are you writing as not a poet, or just like as a normal person without any identity?
Wow, that's okay. I mean, the way I answer that would be something that I said at the start, which is that, like I said, I operate in a very non-linguistic way. Like, I think I started out in my artistic life more as a performer, as a singer, stuff like that. So I was more interested in sounds, in images, and performance art and things like that. So already language is my second language. So I don't think of myself like when I'm writing, I'm actually translating whatever mess is happening in here and making sense of it. So the whole idea of identity, of being a poet, or being an artist doesn't quite register with me. I think I first started writing poetry when I was doing my national service, because Singaporean boys, whatever, we have 2.5 years of pure agony. Okay, suddenly a lot of memories came through. Anyway, yeah, but during that time, I was writing, like I said, translating the mess using words, and I realized that I was like translating images and feelings and sounds on a notebook in which I was supposed to use to talk about, like, I was supposed to take notes from lectures from the corporals and the sergeants who were teaching me how to use a bomb. then I'm like, I fuck all of you. I just write like, my feelings, stuff like that. And then someone actually said to me, oh, are you writing poetry? And I literally my first instinct was that, what's that? I didn't come from anywhere. So I had no like elite school like background. I have no idea what poetry, what's that? Is it like Shakespeare? So that's how I came to creative writing. Yeah. Don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think I found poetry in high school, and it was messy and strange, and I just wanted to have a place to think. I don't think I thought I was a poet. I just I loved music. I mean, I guess I would say the Double Fantasy album. That was the yeah, that was the first fantasy. Yes, yeah. But just thinking about what it meant to have a voice, to just have feelings.
Yeah, because I think I was talking to Sherwin Bitsui, who's a Native American Navajo poet, who had said that there were no books in his house when he was growing up, and no poetry books, and he came to poetry through heavy metal, I think, through the lyrics on the heavy metal album. So people can, that's what I love about poetry, because of course the way poetry's been taught in schools, it's so elite, you have to know this meter, and you have to, but it isn't. You can come to it through multiple doors, and it doesn't have to even be literary or through books or whatever, so. I think there was another question up here. Yeah, so, and yeah.
Hello. Yeah. So I only have one question, but I do want to appreciate, I just hopped in like 40 minutes ago. I'm a business student, but I would say I never learned to appreciate just like art in general. But just saying like once I get more personal anecdotes and experiences, I got to understand a lot more about this world, it's not like one dimension. There's like so many different perspectives. And I do want to appreciate especially Mr. Wong and Sharma's experience about love. As I said before, I never appreciate poetry, but I've been learning a little bit more. I recently read about what is it? I think Shakespeare's sonnet. And yeah, it really sticks to what you guys just mentioned about how platonic love versus like true love. I guess it's a sense of like bravery and a sense of honesty about like taking away your scars and really sharing to everyone about your experience. I think it's just amazing. Not everyone can really relate in the sense that, yeah, thank you guys, but not really in the sense that everyone can relate to it, but in a way that how different people can read it in different understanding and perspective and really getting that sense, not just poetry itself, but personally I like classical music. Like as a nation student, you're forced to like play piano or whatsoever. I never appreciated it, and until now, I get to learn a lot more about how just different people have different experiences, and it's truly amazing to really learn and try to receive and understand about it. And so yeah, and I would say like as I mentioned before, it's like a journey, and the real meaning of it is really how you get to appreciate things by sad means, good means, and look forward, and that's the true meaning about life. And my question is like this. So like, as you guys have so much experience about, art, culture in general, and as you mentioned, it's kind of dangerous, but also inspirational how race, culture, creates different sense of understanding for different people, equality, white, whatsoever, black, and yeah, it's amazing. But imagine you have kids. How do you want them to receive it in the way that you think it's right? Not by like brainwash or anything, but just like, how do you guys interpret it if you have kids and you want them to step in this world? Thank you.
I mean, I think the kids I have are my students in at Pomona College and in other communities, and we share in poetry. We share in a language that gives us joy, that allows for nuance, and we look at a tradition that we share together. I don't know if that really answered your question, but I feel like that nurtures a space of meaningful community with generations to come.
I don't want children.
Okay, thank you. Okay, but what's your name?
Adrian.
Adrian. Thank you, Adrian. Okay, so I'm gonna. So I guess I'm gonna say some closing remarks. But actually, Adrian's comment was very apropos because it actually linked to some things I wanted to say. I'm gonna be brief, and then I'm gonna let Collier say some closing remarks and some housekeeping stuff for about tomorrow. But so thank you, Adrian, because I actually love it when somebody who's not an English major comes in, who's never read poetry before, and they walk in. Because I teach American Studies classes, so sometimes I get people like pre-med or never, they come in, or they're taking a requirement, you know, and they come in and they're just like transformed. So I love it. So I hope you write poetry later. Sure. You know, because that's the dream, right? We want, because we, so actually I wanted to, and so it's great you said this because I actually wanted to say a couple things. One was definitely that when Collier and I thought about this conference, we wanted to open poetry up. We really wanted it not to be this elite country club, which I think when we grew up, I don't know, we both went, you went through an MFA, I went, you know, and also a PhD, but here. But I think a lot of us had traumatizing experiences in workshops and in high school and English majors, you know, where poetry is this like elite, very white thing, and you have to master this secret code to get in. And I'm just so against that, you know. And so I think we wanted to open up, and we wanted to think about poetry in English that wasn't just in the US, UK, Canada, Australia, where else? I guess that's Ireland, you know. But we really wanted to think about all the amazing poetry, because I have a friend who also was a judge of the African Poetry Prize, and he's telling me all this amazing English language poetry is coming out of African countries. And I'm like, we never hear about it, right? So it's just amazing to think about. And of course, we focused on Asia, but a lot of great English language poetry, as we saw the last 2 days, right? Just amazing poetry that's as good as anything or better than anything that's written in the US or the UK. And we really wanted to open that up. So I think that, I hope the conference has done that, and they at least opened the door for that. So that was definitely one thing. The other thing for me was also, and I'm sure for Collier too, was sort of touching on what Adrian brought up, which is that I don't want more students of color or students, not just students of color, students to be traumatized in poetry. And so many, after I wrote my book, a lot of people came up and was like, thank you, because I didn't know why I was feeling this way. I was being treated as the one representative, like, Black, you know, person, like everyone, you know, like you're in a workshop and you're talking about this personal stuff and everyone turns to you, or you're supposed to speak for everyone. It's just very hard. People have really hard experiences in English classes and workshops. And I definitely, in my own scholarship, and I'm not a creative writer, I wanted to make it a place where people did not have to feel that way, you know. And it's just an ongoing journey. It's a struggle. It's an ongoing struggle. There's a lot of work still to be done. But I definitely feel like my work, and I think the conference too, for me, is really about the students and the young people. You know, I just don't want other people to have to go through some of the crap that a lot of us have had to go through, or that my parents were English professors, you know, and they had a hard time. It was very difficult, you know. And I remember when my father first, you know, went to Davidson College in North Carolina, he became the class poet as a guy from China who had, you know, come through Hong Kong. But it was impossible in a way, because I wrote his obituary in 2015. So when I looked at the arc of everything, I was like, this was impossible. This was never going to work, right? No, it's true, because you see the arc of a life, and you see what he wanted was to be a poet. He wanted to be a professor of English. And you could just see that he did to a certain extent, but the odds were just stacked. It was never going to happen because the times had not shifted, right? And I remember one thing he would tell me, and I could tell there was pain. He said, there was a famous poet who's no longer famous, thank God, named John Ciardi in the 50s, who was like now like a versifier or something. And he had visited the college, and he had said something like, non-native English speakers will never be good poets. They can never. And obviously that's totally bullshit. You know, we see that from, but I remember he related that. It was like, it was painful because I think he believed it, or it was a limit. So for me, like thinking about race and poetry, to really think about how poetics is deeply racialized, and our concepts of like tone and description and everything that gets done in a workshop is not neutral, is really important, because it's like a space to open up, not in terms of like, you know, even social justice, but it's just, I don't want people to suffer. It really sucks, you know? And it sucks for someone from Hong Kong or China or the Philippines or wherever, you know, Vietnam, to have to feel like they're less than because they have an accent, or their English isn't as good. Because believe me, there are plenty of native speakers and their English is not good, you know, and they don't have accents. So I think it's really important also to open for young people, because I don't want young people to have that experience in English classes or workshops. And it should be that the business major, the physics major, or somebody who's not even gone to college can go to poetry and find joy in it, find expression in it, because poetry is wonderful. And even though a lot of English language poetry was like an arm of imperialism and colonialism, it doesn't take away from the fact that you can still find joy and solace and stuff. And I always often said, I said this already at the conference, is that the deepest bond I had with my father was romantic poetry. It was not Chinese culture. It was Keats and Wordsworth and Blake. He wrote his dissertation on Blake before Blake was popular. You know, that was the deepest bond. That was the power. And he would say, you know, a thing of beauty is a joy forever. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. And that was always so, you know, or to see a world in a grain of sand. You know, and so I think that the difficulty is that the racism that a lot of us face is that people just assume that you don't have that relationship to the English language or to poetry. It's all about, oh, it must be like, I mean, I get asked all the time, I don't know if Prageeta has, but, you know, is English your native language? Or, you know, oh, it must be about Buddhism or Confucianism. It's like, no, you know. So I think that, for me, has been the goal of our, at least the conference should open up some spaces. And I hope that the conference will seed other things happening in other spaces in Asia or wherever people are going back to, that it will actually grow other things. So those are my comments, but I'm gonna let Collier speak, and then she's gonna wrap everything up. But thank you everyone for coming out for the last couple days. And the poets, I thank the poets most of all. The poets have been amazing, amazing, amazing.